And so we continue our journey of looking at the basic conditions required for healing. We've looked at pure air, we're looking now at sunshine. In our last lecture we looked at sunshine, and now we're looking at temperance. Not a word you hear very much now, but the dictionary definition of temperance is not taking anything into the body that will harm it and taking in moderation the good things. So that gives us a list of things that should never be done or never be taken into the body, and a list of things that should be taken in moderation. Really, all good things should be taken in moderation. So we'll say all good things, because even good food can turn to poison if overdone. I have a book in our library called The Physiology of Digestion by Dr. William Beaumont. And he came to the conclusion after decades of research on the stomach, he said it is not quality of food that is of the most important, it's quantity. So even good food can be overdone. All work and no play makes Jack a very dull boy. We've come to a strange time on planet Earth where it surprises me how parents are not teaching their children to work. And you know when children love to work? When they're little. And most parents don't take use of that. You see, the day doesn't come when the child suddenly stands in front of the parent and says, "I'll work now." I always taught my children to work from a young age. I taught them that they were part of the family firm. And if a child dirties a dish as they eat their dinner, they should be part of cleaning that dish. Very simple basics. You see, and when a parent teaches a child to work, they've got time to play with them. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and all play and no work makes Jack a very poor boy. So you could say it's a balance, moderation in these things. But there are some things that should never enter the human body if you're looking for optimum performance, and I consider the pure crystallized acid that's been extracted from the sugarcane plant one of the most lethal substances ever to be introduced to the human frame. Why do I say that? Well, sugar is as closely related to the sugarcane plant as heroin is to the poppy plant, and yet really more lethal. Let me show you. When sugar goes into the body, blood glucose levels rise dramatically. Not in sugarcane, because in the sugarcane, the sugar or the glucose is all bound up in fibre and it's slowly released. But this pure acid that's been extracted from the sugarcane plant, when it's taken into the body, how would it have been taken into the body? What would most Aussies have had for breakfast this morning? Cereal. I challenge you, find a cereal with no sugar. Some of them are incredibly high. Blood glucose levels rise dramatically. Very quickly, the pancreas responds by releasing insulin to get the blood glucose levels down. Because it was a crisis and too much insulin was released, because there was so much glucose, blood glucose levels start to drop too low. This is a crisis, and this is a crisis. Now blood glucose levels are too low. And so the brain says to the pancreas, quick, stop the insulin and release the glycogen. Glycogen is the hormone that gets the blood glucose levels up again. But the person usually has a little bit more sugar down there. So up they go again, now too high. So the brain says to the pancreas, now we're too high. Stop the glycogen, release the insulin. And we've got a situation now where many people's blood sugars levels are doing this all day long instead of this. Instead of a nice, steady, sure, consistent supply of nutrients, we get too high, too lows, and basically crisis, 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 crisis. And what's happening is the cell starts to resist the insulin. Let's go back to the cell. So here is the cell. We've got our 20-step pathway, and then we've got our 8-step pathway. And over on the side, we've got our glycogen stores, the quick-release glucose stores. And what happens is, when the insulin's released to get the glucose into the cell, and if the energy cycle is full, and the glycogen stores are full, then a situation happens where the cell begins to resist insulin. It's called insulin resistance. And what happens when you've got insulin resistance happening? The glucose stays in the blood. The message is given to the pancreas, more insulin, so more insulin's released. See, we've got this vicious cycle. And eventually the pancreas just stops releasing the insulin. We've got 400 new diabetics diagnosed every day in Australia. It's an epidemic on this high sugar diet. I challenge you, go to the supermarket, it's in everything. Especially with the fat phobia that's hit Australia and has for the last 20 years. When they take all the fat out of a food, they've taken all the flavour out. For instance, yogurt. How many non-fat, low-fat yogurts do you find? Now they're not palatable at all. So what do they do to make them palatable? They add a bit of sugar. Now that person that eats that low-fat yogurt, sparked with sugar to make it palatable, now their body's dumping a dangerous fat, which we talked about yesterday. You see the predicament. But something else has come in. You see, Aussies have been using sugar for decades. Something else has come into the equation that has caused this explosion of diabetes. It is wheat. Now, the wheat I'm referring to is the wheat that you will find in every pasta, every bread, every biscuit, every cake, every cereal. And what that does is it contains a starch. Now, the wheat that is found today is a hybridised wheat. It was hybridised in the 1950s. Dr. Norman Bulag received a Nobel Prize in 1969 for this hybridised wheat. And in the 1970s, that hybridised wheat went worldwide. And that's why I say every bread, every wheat product you find today, it will be the hybridised wheat. Tomorrow, I'm going to discuss the gluten aspect of this hybridised wheat. But what I want to show you this morning is the starch aspect. And the starch that is in wheat is amylopectin, amylopectin A, it's called. And amylopectin A gets the blood sugar level up very quickly, like that. That's your amylopectin A. Amylopectin B is found in bananas and potatoes. And for those who are familiar with the glycemic index of food, the glycemic index of food is where the sugar is released into the blood. Anything above 55 is high, anything below 55 is low. And banana and potatoes are quite high. So amylopectin B is found in bananas and potatoes, and that gets it up quite high. It's basically like that. And amylopectin C is what you find in legumes. And amylopectin C is a blood sugar level like this. So it's the amylopectin A, it's this specific starch that you'll find in the hybridised wheat. Look what it's doing to blood sugar levels. In fact, if this is sugar's blood sugar levels, this is wheat's, because of this amylopectin A, this type of starch that is in the hybridised wheat. Let's look at the glycemic index. So GI, glycemic index, how quickly the food breaks down to glucose in the blood. Anything above 55 is high. So 55 basically is baseline. Cherries are about 26. So cherries are nice and low. So let's have a look at sugar. And I'm referring to the pure crystallised acid that's been extracted from the sugarcane plant. That's 59. And that does not surprise us. Where's white bread? And there's an American nutritionist, he's got a saying, he says, the whiter the bread, the sooner you're dead. But that's changing when you see this. White bread is 69. Because of this amylopectin A, can you see that white wheat bread is higher than even refined sugar. Wholemeal bread. Where does wholemeal bread sit? Wholemeal bread is 72. 72. Wholemeal bread gets the blood sugar level up higher than white bread? How could this be? It's because the wholemeal bread, not being refined, it has more amylopectin A in it. You see that? And what are most diabetics told to eat? Wholemeal bread, whole grain bread, whole grain cereal. And you talk to diabetics, they're not conquering their diabetes. We have seen many people conquer their diabetes. We had a man come here for the last 2 weeks. Halfway through the program, after 1 week, he stopped his insulin because his blood sugar levels were averaging 6 every morning. He'd never seen that. So he stopped his insulin. Halfway through the 2nd week, he stopped 2 more of his diabetic medications. So halfway through the 2nd week, he's off all his diabetic medication, and his blood sugar levels, they didn't stay at 6, they came up a little bit, but I said, don't you worry about it, you're coming off the medication. He said, I used to be 23. He said, the highest level I got here at the health retreat was something like 9. That's remarkable, and that's off his medication. If you want to pursue this subject, you can pursue it a little bit more in a book called Wheat Belly by Dr. William Davis, where he shows very clearly the research that is showing that. And this explains why the wheat is getting these highs, higher even than banana and potatoes that are well acknowledged to get blood sugar levels up quickly. And diabetics are usually told to stop potatoes and to stop bananas, but they're not told to stop the wheat. Why not? Because this is not universally known, but you can know it by reading Dr. William Davis' book, Wheat Belly, where he shows it very clearly. You know why the book's called Wheat Belly? Because these blood sugar level highs that wheat's causing is causing it to all store as fat on the belly. That's the book, Wheat Belly. Caffeine. How does caffeine affect the body in a negative way? Let me show you. This is a nerve cell, and we have 1 trillion of these in our brain. This is what our brain is made up of, nerve cells. This is the arm that comes out of the nerve cell called the axon. These are the little filaments on the end. These are the boutons. And here we have the next nerve cell. These are the receiving stations called the dendrites. And here are the dendrites here. These cells communicate with each other via little chemical messengers. So the little chemical messengers come in, they're encapsulated, go down the arm into the little boutons, and then they're released out to the next nerve cell, and the whole process is repeated from nerve cell to nerve cell. These messages can be travelling at 200 kilometres an hour. One nerve cell has the ability to communicate with 20,000 other nerve cells. What caffeine does is that it interferes with these neurotransmitters. One neurotransmitter is adenosine. And adenosine is the neurotransmitter that acts like the brakes. Our brain runs according to precision balance, and anything that interferes with the brakes is potentially dangerous. When caffeine goes in, adenosine levels drop. Brakes are failing. Body's got to do something. So it quickly develops extra little receptor sites on the dendrites to grab every bit of adenosine that comes through. Then the person comes to Misty Mountain Health Retreat. Adenosine levels go back to normal. Receptor sites get flooded. Oh, does that hurt? People say to me, Barbara, do you drink coffee? I say, no, I just watch the people suffer. Day 1 of Misty Mountain Health Retreat. If someone says to me, Barbara, how can I prepare for my stay at Misty Mountain? I say, start reducing the coffee. Start reducing any caffeine. Let me define caffeine in coffee, in tea, in Red Bulls, all your energy drinks. There's not much in chocolate. But most people, I say most women that I meet, can't stop at one square. So a whole block of chocolate, you're starting to get there. Caffeine also affects another neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that has to do with brain function, and it rises under the effect of caffeine. That's why a lot of people say, oh, I can't do my work unless I've had my cup of coffee. It just gets my brain working. That is true. It does get it working. But very quickly the brain says, we've got an imbalance here. Stop making so much acetylcholine. So there might be an initial rise and then there's always a corresponding dump. The other neurotransmitter is dopamine. Dopamine is an interesting hormone because dopamine is not a happiness hormone, it's a pursuit of happiness hormone. It actually gets us to pursue happiness. It rises under the effect of caffeine. Many addictive substances release dopamine, and that is what causes a person to go for the next cup of coffee, for the next cigarette, for the next drink of alcohol, for the next drug. Dopamine, it's the pursuit of happiness, it's the pursuit of reward hormone. It's dopamine that gets me weeding my garden, but then I get my reward of a weeded garden. So it's not that dopamine's bad, but in the case of addictions, it's actually overused for the person to keep going and getting the pursuit of happiness, but they never find happiness. Eventually, when a person is continually having coffee day after day after day, dopamine levels get exhausted. And then the pursuit of happiness is not there. And what a person eventually experiences is an inability to even do anything. Caffeine dramatically interferes with the neurotransmitters in the brain. The definition of depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain, and caffeine is one of the most responsible for that. I will be exploring the effect of caffeine on the brain in more detail in my lecture on the mind. Suffice to say now, this is best kept out of the body. Mercury. Mercury is a neurotoxin. There's no safe dose of mercury. About 50% of dentists today are still using mercury. But I don't know about you, but I don't want a neurotoxin anywhere near me. You've heard of Mad Hatter's disease? Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. Hatters went mad because they used to glue the felt hats together with mercury. And of course it went in through their skin. And this neurotoxin started killing brain cells, even eating away at the myelin sheath, which is that fatty substance around the arm coming out of the nerve cell. A person is in a very dangerous situation if they're on a fat-free diet and they've got high mercury levels, for instance, mercury fillings in the mouth, or they're having a high fish diet, especially the larger the fish. You see, mercury is bioaccumulative. That means that the more mercury that is going into the body, the more it is accumulating. And this is why it's the larger fish that have the highest concentration of mercury. So for people that love fish, I say keep it to a small part of the diet and just go for your smaller fish. The smaller the fish, the smaller the concentration of mercury. It's the fish and the fillings, the two F's, where most people are subject to mercury today or exposed to mercury. Just remember there's no safe dose of it and it is a neurotoxin. Alcohol. Alcohol is also a neurotoxin. There is no safe dose of mercury and there is no safe dose of alcohol. Mercury was banned in America for 300 years till about the early 1920s when 3 European dentists started their own association, the American Dental Association, where they legalised mercury. Why do they love mercury? Because it is the only metal that is liquid, and so it moulds to the teeth, and it is antiseptic. It's antiseptic, all right, it's anti-life, it's anti-human. No safe dose of it. Alcohol was banned in America for 13 years, from 1920 to 1933. And if you can get the results of that 13 years, why do I say that? Because it's very difficult to get the results. They like you to think that alcohol was legalised to stop the black market, the mafia, the moonshine, but the American government promised the American people if they legalised alcohol, they would not have to pay taxes. But you can get some figures. One of the figures is mental institution occupancy dropped to 8% when the alcohol was gone. Domestic violence almost wiped out. The jails were a lot emptier when the alcohol was illegal in America. Some states were a little bit slower on changing around, but the results were phenomenal. There's no safe dose of alcohol. It's a neurotoxin. That means it kills brain cells. And I don't know about you, but I don't want any more brain cells to go. And the brain cells we have now, we have for life. So alcohol must go if you're looking for optimum performance. Tobacco. There are some pretty impressive pictures on the side of the road today. I don't know whether impressive of the world. Some of them are horror pictures showing the effect of tobacco, and every single one of them is true. One of the slogans said, tobacco affects almost every organ in the body. Wrong, every organ, because it affects the blood, but it particularly affects the respiratory. So a person who smokes can get nasal cancer, they can get tongue cancer, they can get throat cancer. Cancer can go all through the lung area. There is no safe dose of this. Have you ever had a fire and cleaned your chimney out? That gives you an idea of what's building up in the lungs of human beings. Drugs do not cure disease. They only change the form and location of the disease. Every drug has a side effect. I had a guest say to me recently, he said, Barbara, they're not side effects, they're effects. They're one of the effects of the medication. Absolutely right, the drug might alleviate one symptom, but it can create a whole lot of other symptoms. That's why I say to people, if you're on any medication at all, you need to go to the chemist and get a printout and have a very good look at the side effects of the medication that you're on, because every drug has a side effect. Some drugs must not be stopped immediately. That's why I say if you're on medication, you must work with a health professional who can show you how to ease off and implement lifestyle changes. Even herbs, there are a whole range of things that can be done to bring about a healing condition in the body. Monosodium glutamate. Monosodium glutamate is called an excitotoxin because it causes the nerve cells on the tongue to overfire. And when the nerve cells on the tongue overfire, the food tastes fantastic. Do you know what that means? Rotten food would taste good. Do you know it's one of the causes of food poisoning is people are eating rotten food and they don't know it because of the amount of MSG is in there making anything taste good. When we eat food in its natural state, when we're eating organic food that has a far higher mineral content giving it a better taste, there's no need to go to the artificial flavourings and colourings. You'll find MSG in the 620s to 630s, that's the number. But be careful, they're putting it under different names now. Hydrolyzed vegetable protein, hydrogenated vegetable protein, and flavour enhancers. They're other names for MSG. If MSG is an excitotoxin, and if it causes the nerve cells on the tongue to overfire, it causes nerve cells everywhere to overfire. And the highest concentration will be found where the spinal cord meets the brain, and you'll find a lot of people who have a meal with MSG in it get a pain in that area. Chemicals. We've got to get the chemicals out of our toothpaste, out of our shampoo, out of our laundry detergent, out of our homes. Shannon Lush, she's often on Talkback Radio. She has a book called Completely Spotless. We have it in our library. And she has alternatives to just about everything regarding cleaning. I bought my daughter a book called Good Old Days, Good Old Ways, and that book shows all the ways that housewives used to clean things using natural products. We don't even need to go to that. In the supermarket today, you can find biodegradable washing detergents. You can even find whiteners. I know Eco Store is one. There are actually quite a few. I like white pillowcases, but I don't want to use bleach. But these whiteners do a very good job, and they don't have any toxic ingredients in them. This is a very socially acceptable list, isn't it? There's no need for me to talk about the dangers of cyanide, arsenic, ice, heroin, but there definitely is a need to discuss the dangers of this list, because most people will agree with me this is a very socially acceptable list. And little by little, like the dripping tap on a stone, these substances are eating away at the proper functioning of the human body. But I think one of the scariest places they're eating away at proper body functions is the brain. And in my last lecture, I'm going to show you how these things directly affect the brain. There are 1,700 new cases of Alzheimer's diagnosed every week in Australia. Here we have another epidemic. And little by little, these are causing a deterioration of the proper functioning of the brain. And this is why temperance is an important law of health, because if you don't turn the tap off, you're still going to be mopping up in the other corner. If you don't find the cause, you will never get a cure. And because all these substances don't appear to make you sick as soon as you have them, often people think that a little bit won't hurt you, but not so. We're going to look at our fourth law now, which is the law of rest. There's a tiny little gland in the base of our brain called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland releases 4 hormones every night. And it's about as big as the little circle that I have drawn here. The pineal gland. In my Anatomy and Physiology book of the 70s, it is said not much is known about the pineal gland, but a lot is known about the pineal gland today. Light and dark signals are fed through the optic nerve to a control centre in the brain where your body clock is located. And the body clock communicates with the pineal gland and causes a release of 4 hormones between the hours. Daylight saving is between 10 and 3 a.m. When winter comes, or if you're living in Queensland, it'll be between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. It is in these hours that these 4 hormones are released, and they are responsible for revival and renewal. One is serotonin. Serotonin is your mood hormone. This explains why the children aren't very happy if they have late nights, either of the adults actually. You want to feel good every day, all day, go to bed early. Arginine vasotocin. Arginine vasotocin is a hormone that puts you into a deep sleep. Arginine vasotocin is also your natural painkiller. If you have any type of pain, go to bed early. Your natural painkiller will kick in. I meet people who have trouble sleeping. And when I ask them what time they go to bed, they say, oh, I don't go to bed till midnight. Because they have this reasoning that if they stay awake a little bit longer, they'll get more tired and they'll sleep better. But the opposite's true. The earlier you go to bed, the more likely you are to fall into a deep sleep because of arginine vasotocin. I read an article in Time magazine on sleep. They said, sleeping tablets don't do a whole lot because you don't wake revived, and it's really not fixing the problem. They said, what helps more than anything else the research has shown is cognitive behavioural therapy. Let me illustrate cognitive behavioural therapy. We had a lady do our program and she said to me, my sleep drives me crazy. She said, I wake up at 3 every morning, she said, and I get so annoyed. I get so annoyed, why am I waking at this time? And I can't sleep again. After hearing this lecture, I said to her, now if you wake at 3 in the morning, you can say, this is fantastic, I've got my hours of power, and you can just relax and plan your day. And she did. And she actually went back to sleep. It's because she was so annoyed it was affecting her worry, so she could not sleep. So these are your hours of power. These are your hours of renewal, regeneration. Another hormone is epithalamin. Epithalamin is a hormone that reduces aging, and it also increases learning capacity. When you hear the lecture on the mind, you will see that we should never be out of school. We should always be learning new things. Many people in the latter years of life have trouble learning new things because they're dehydrated and they're going to bed too late and they're not exercising, as you will see. So if you want to increase your learning capacity, make sure you're asleep at the moment by 10. In the winter, make sure you're asleep by 9. Those early mornings are called the hours of gold. About 6 years ago, I had to do a 10,000 word thesis to finish my nutrition course. I had 1 week to do it. I didn't have to do it in a week, but I wanted to do it in a week because I wanted to graduate at the up and coming seminar. And I did it. I went to bed at 8 o'clock. I woke at 4 o'clock. I had 2 hours of peak study time, and I made it. And when I read my thesis today, I think, wow, who wrote this? Well done. Brain sparky at that time of the morning. The last one is melatonin. Melatonin has a nickname. It's called the fix and rejuvenate nighttime hormone. So sleeping in these hours allows the pineal gland to release these hormones that are responsible for our body getting rest and rejuvenation in the night. And there are things that you can do that will cause an increase in the output of these hormones, and there are things that you can do that will cause a decrease. Let's look at those. Increase. Laughter. No wonder the proverb says, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. That brings us to the decrease. Worry. What's the old saying for worry? Worry is blind and cannot discern the future. So we need to laugh more. I think I mentioned the other day that children laugh 125 times a day. So should we. We should laugh more. Sleeping in the dark. You see, it is light and dark signals that are fed through the optic nerve to the control centre in the brain that gives the messages to the pineal gland. So it's very important that the lights are off while you're sleeping. Sleep in the dark. Sunshine in the day. These are both giving very clear messages to the pineal gland. So it doesn't surprise you to hear me say that artificial light is very confusing to the pineal gland. Especially, I'm referring to the screens. How many people's eyes are glued to screens in these hours? And I'm referring to the television, I'm referring to the iPod, the iPad, the computer, the Game Boys. I say to parents, you must have some rules in your home. My brother-in-law gathers all the teenagers' technology of in the evening and charges it in his office overnight. It's a very good idea. I think one of the contributing factors to the mental illness we're seeing, especially in adolescents and teenagers, is the overexposure of the eyes to these screens when the pineal gland should be reviving and recharging. And as you'll see on Saturday morning when we look at the lecture on the mind, the frontal lobe of the brain doesn't develop till 30. We're getting brains that are getting damaged before they're even developed. We have computers, handy stuff. I don't have to carry 2 suitcases loads of books when I'm doing a school. I just need a computer and it's all on there. Very handy. It's the overexposure, as I looked at when I discussed the eyes, but it also is in within these hours. So you'll be doing your body and your brain a great favour if you make a decision not to allow your eyes to observe the screens in these hours. Alcohol. Alcohol causes a 41% reduction in the output of these hormones. So that bit of red wine might put you to sleep, but you'll wake with half-charged batteries. Caffeine. Caffeine causes a cut in half for 6 hours. So these hormones are cut in half for 6 hours after caffeine. Exercise. I will be discussing exercise in a later lecture, but when you implement the exercise that causes the body to start running more efficiently, you can double the output of those hormones at night. Fasting. When we go to bed with empty tummies and quiet intestines, the intestines produce tryptophan. And tryptophan is a key amino acid used in the production of melatonin and serotonin. Meat is high in an amino acid called methionine. And methionine, in high amounts, blocks the action of tryptophan. This knowledge allows you to get more out of your day, more out of your life. What's the old saying? Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. They didn't know about the pineal gland. In the 1970s, they didn't know about the pineal gland. But science today is proving the truth behind that old saying. I was reading an interview of a 116-year-old Russian man on his secrets of longevity. He says, I rise with the sun, I go down with the sun. He didn't realise it, but he's getting his good quota of his reviving, renewing hormones every single night. There's one other part that I'd like to cover in rest. And that is an organ of the body that rarely gets a rest today. It's called stomach. We have one stomach. I'm going to put a big number 1 here, just to remind us how many stomachs we have. Just one. You see cows, sheep, goats, they have several stomachs, and they can eat all day long because it goes from one stomach into the next stomach, into the next stomach. But we only have one. A couple of years ago, I got a book from America. Amazon found it for me. Found it for me in Aristotle State College Library, Teacher's Library. And it's called The Physiology of Digestion by Dr. William Beaumont. I'd read of articles referring to this story. It's a remarkable story. And it happened in the probably early 1800s, where a young man named Alexis St. Martin sustained a gunshot wound to the stomach. So this gunshot, it was an accident, went through and it blew out part of his ribs and some of his stomach. At the time, Dr. William Beaumont was only 25, and he attended Alexis St. Martin, and he said he would not live. And every day he visited him, and every day Alexis St. Martin was picking up and getting a little brighter. And there were 2 things that Dr. Beaumont put on his wound. One was aloe vera, excellent choice, and the other was myrrh. Myrrh is a strong antiseptic. Nice that there was a time when doctors used herbs. You know, there are some doctors using herbs today, but the majority not. He said about 4 times over the next few months, a big tumour rose, burst, and a 2-inch piece of rib came out. Isn't that interesting? Why did the body make a tumour? to get rid of a piece of rib. And then after that, everything settled down. And Alexis St. Martin moved around, was able to eat and function, but he was left with something unusual, a hole in his stomach. It was about there. And in the book, The Physiology of Digestion, there are a couple of pencil drawings. And in the morning, foals would sort of be coming out of the hole a little bit like that. When he started to eat and the stomach muscles started to move that food around, then the foals would go back in somewhat. Dr. William Beaumont saw his opportunity and he started to experiment on Alexis St. Martin and this hole. And he would get a piece of food, he'd tie it to a silk thread and he would put it in the hole. And after 2 hours he'd pull it out, have a look at it. Then he'd put it back in, then he'd pull it out again. He did numerous studies. In fact, the book that I have, the first third, is the story. And it's a remarkable story because Alexis St. Martin lived till he was in his 80s. He married, had children. Every few years, Dr. Beaumont would telegram him and say, please come back for a year. I'll put your children through school. I'll put you in a nice house. I'd like to just do a few more experiments. The last 2/3 of the book is where Dr. Beaumont meticulously documented all his experiments. It's fascinating. Dr. Beaumont found with his research that digestion is accomplished within 3 to 4 hours. And then he noted that the stomach loves a rest of 1 hour. Put that together and the equation is 5 hours at least between meals. And the stomach hasn't changed. And how many people today are told to graze? How many people today are told to eat lots of little meals? I've had a few ladies and they told me that their doctor said eat lots of little meals, it'll raise your metabolic rate. Do you know how it raises your metabolic rate? It irritates the stomach so much, which irritates the nervous system, and in that way it raises the metabolic rate just a little. The most powerful way to raise your metabolic rate is to exercise. But Dr. Beaumont found there were 5 situations where the food was still in the stomach 8 hours later. So let's have a look at those 5 things. Number 1 was overeating. Dr. Beaumont came to the conclusion that there's only so many digestive enzymes released in the stomach, so if too much food goes into that stomach, it basically just can't do it. It's like asking me to carry up the hill here a heavy load that my big strong son could almost run up the hill with, but I'm struggling. Putting too much food in the stomach, it just can't do it. How many people want to eat an evening meal on the 25th of December? Not many, because their Christmas lunch was bigger and richer, and the food is often still in the stomach 8 hours later. Often eating. Dr. Beaumont found that if Alexis St. Martin put more food in before the previous meal had been digested, the pyloric sphincter shut. The pyloric sphincter is a little valve at the end of the stomach into the first part of the small intestine. And he came to the conclusion that there were sensors coming out of the pyloric sphincter. And what he found was when the food goes in, it goes round and round and round and stops. And then it goes round and round and round and stops. And every time it stops, the sensors go out. And when the sensors sense that the food is broken down to the required state, it'll start to open. And little by little, the food will come through. So let's have a look at what's happening at 9:30 in the morning, maybe 2.5 hours after breakfast was eaten. And there's still probably a remnant, maybe there's about 1/3 of the breakfast still in there. And then the person has morning tea. Maybe they have a biscuit. Maybe they have a cake. Maybe they have a pie. Maybe they have a sandwich. Or maybe they're really healthy and have an apple and a handful of nuts. Actually, it doesn't matter what it is. It's food. The senses quickly pick up that it's not broken down to the right state, and so the door is shut. After about an hour, the apple and the nuts or the sandwich are broken down to the desired state, and pyloric sphincter starts to open little by little. And because of the going round and round and stop, it's in the stopping sign that it starts to take bits of food through. So let's say they had the apple and the handful of nuts at 9:30. 12 o'clock, lunch happens. 12 o'clock, the food isn't all out. Lunch comes in. How big's lunch? Maybe it's this big. Pyloric sphincter shuts again. And this is happening all through the day, to the point where Dr. Beaumont found remnants of breakfast still in the stomach 8 hours later. Large fluid with the meal. And isn't this an Aussie habit? Every time Michael and I are travelling and we go to a restaurant, the waiter says, "What will you have to drink?" And we say, "We won't have anything to drink." And you can see they're very challenged by this, because everyone drinks with their meal. So they say, "Oh, we'll just bring you water." Now we let them, because otherwise they won't leave us alone. And one day when a waiter was just really floored by us saying we won't have anything to drink, I said, "We've already drunk our water." We're such a fast society today. People run, work, sit down to lunch. Oh, they haven't drunk. So the water is drunk with the meals. I say to our guests, if you're thirsty, by all means have a mouthful. A mouthful won't do a great amount at reducing your hydrochloric acid, your pepsinogen. But large fluid with the meal absolutely will. We need to stop drinking water about half an hour before the meal, and then resume drinking water about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours after the meal. And that's easy done, especially when you leave 5 hours between the meal. Alcohol. Whenever Alexis St. Martin had alcohol with the meal, it slowed down digestion. Fear and anger, stress. Whenever Alexis St. Martin was irritable or angry, digestion just stopped. I think sometimes he got a little irritable with the food going in and out of his hole in his stomach. Most of the time he was fine, but Dr. Beaumont found that if he'd been drinking alcohol the night before, he was more irritated, so a few things came together to cause that. How many Aussies could tick every box here? No wonder stomachs aren't working properly. Stomach's very important because that's where the start of our protein is broken down. Protein's a very important nutrient. We should be eating breakfast like a king. We should be eating lunch like a queen. And we should be eating tea like a pauper. And sometimes paupers don't eat. How many Aussies today are having breakfast like a pauper, lunch like a pauper, and tea is the king and the queen together? And then they sit down in the easy chair and they fall asleep very quickly. Body says, finally, we've got some nourishment. Oh no, they've gone to sleep. What does the body have to do with all that excess glucose now? It has to store it as fat. And that's another contributing factor to our 63% of Australians obese or overweight. To be able to go 5 hours between the meal, we should be eating a high fibre diet. You see, fibre slowly releases the glucose. The high fibre diet gives you this lovely, consistent delivery of nutrients. We should be having great proteins. We've already defined how important the protein is. And we should be having healthy fats. Ideally, the majority of our fats should come from the food we eat, nuts, seeds, avocados, and a little bit from the concentrated oils in the coconut oil, the olive oil. This afternoon I'll be defining that. These are the 3 food groups that keep the food in the stomach longer. These are the 3 food groups that will ensure a nice, consistent delivery of nutrients to every cell in the body. This will allow you to go 5 hours between meals. What about children? I raised 8 children by giving them breakfast like a king, lunch like a queen, and tea like a pauper. A great evening meal for a child is a banana. A banana causes a release of melatonin so they sleep better. Not everyone can eat lunch like a queen like we do because they're at work, they're at school, they're in the office. So I say, make breakfast a little bit more substantial. Ensure that you've got your 3 essentials in lunch, and maybe make tea a little lighter and a little earlier. Some mothers have told me that when the children come home from school, that's when they serve the main meal. And that's when children are hungry, isn't it? When they get home from school. So it's just working out what suits you. One lady said to me, but it's so nice to sit and eat with the family at night. I said, yes, it is. But just make it lighter. It's such freedom for a woman. I homeschooled my children, so it was very easy to give breakfast like a king and lunch like a queen and tea like a pauper. We'd garden of an evening, especially on the cool summer evenings, when we couldn't see which was a weed and which was a plant anymore. We'd come in, we'd shower, story time, and then straight to bed. No big evening meal, no big wash up. It's fantastic. One lady said, but Barbara, you don't understand, that's the only time I've got time is at night. I said, well, what you can do at night, you can prepare for the next day. You can do a little bit of prep so you do have a nice substantial breakfast, so that you do have some great things in a packed lunch. And then at night, it can just be light. Some of our guests find they just have a protein smoother at night, or soup if the weather's cool, or just a salad, but something light. You've just got to find out what works with you. Our stomach hasn't changed. Alexis St. Martin's stomach was the same as our stomach. It works the same. I think it would be good to have his book published again. The problem is we'd have to have an interpreter because it was written in 1833. I understand it because I read the King James Version of the Bible, so I'm used to the lovely poetic Old English. But his findings changed the nutrition world. Up until then, nutritionists, doctors, they thought that digestion was purely a mechanical process, but he showed that it is also a chemical process. We need to eat breakfast like a king that contains the fibre, the protein and the fat, and then we need to stop. No more goes in other than water after a couple of hours till lunch. Many people who need to drink with their meals need to because they sit to their meal dehydrated. So the time to hydrate your body is before your meal, between your meal. I wake up at about 5 every morning. I eat at approximately 7. I do my exercise program in the middle there, and I'm able to have 3, sometimes 4 glasses of water over that time. I eat at 7. And I often do not drink water again till about 10:30. You see, I'm not at all thirsty. I'm well hydrated. I was well hydrated when I sat to eat my breakfast. So at about 10:30, I might start drinking water. I usually have lunch at 1. And then I can easily drink maybe 2 or 3 or 4 glasses before lunch. If I do that, I've done about 1 3/4 or 1.5 litres by lunch, which means all I have to do after lunch, before bed, between lunch and bed, is drink 2, maybe 3 glasses of water. When a person is not used to drinking water, it's important to plan like that. How many people wake up in the morning, don't have water, and then sit to the table and have their breakfast with their orange juice and their cup of coffee? Both contain dehydrating agents. Caffeine and sugar are two of the worst dehydrators. And how many people try and hydrate themselves with that? Water and water alone will hydrate it. Let's look after the stomach. We've only got one. And if we give it the right conditions, it will serve us well.